Then after, I guess, about 3 years, I got a phone call one morning from someone at the World Bank. Paul Mayo was his name. He asked me if I was interested in coming to Washington to interview for a job at the World Bank. And I thought, well, that sounded like an interesting thing. I checked with my wife. She's a teacher, or she was a teacher, and she was not too keen on making a move to Sydney or Melbourne or one of the Australian cities where she'd have to start again at the bottom of the seniority hierarchy. So I checked with her, Chris, what about you don't want to go 200 miles, what about 10,000? And she said, wonderful, let's do it. So in 1991, we headed off to Washington.
How many years were you at the bank?
25. Yeah, so, and it turned out to be absolutely wonderful. I ended up, by the time I arrived, I had the good fortune to work for Ron Duncan for many years, so Ron was a great influence, always looking for new insights into things, and yeah, that was a great pleasure. In that time, I actually did quite a lot on trade in manufactures rather than agriculture. I moved away from my original discipline, which was good and bad. It was great to be learning about new things, but I did miss the agricultural issues. I must say, though, the training I'd had and particularly the exposure to the debates in the Australian Agricultural Economic Society, that really stood me in very good stead. And I'd really enjoyed the 2 international conferences of agricultural economists that I went to in those days. I went in '85 to the Malaga conference, and in 1988 to the Buenos Aires conference. And both of these were life-changing experiences. I really remember just vividly going to see Amartya Sen give a talk on, in fact it was what's known as the Elmhurst lecture, the keynote, the most prestigious lecture on his work on poverty and famines. So I came in to that session thinking I knew something about famines. Famines were something that happened when there was a drought and the crop shriveled up and people starved because there wasn't enough food. And he explained very, very eloquently that wasn't really the issue at all. The problem of famine rose when some people didn't have access to the food that they needed. Obviously you need enough food to go around, but his work on poverty and famines, he pointed out that most famines occur when there is in fact enough food to go around, but some people don't get access to it. And he illustrated that most vividly with the experience of the Great Bengal Famine of 1943 that he'd lived through. And that, of course, that famine had nothing to do with harvest failure. It was actually a boom famine that the British at the time were spending vast amounts on defence in Bengal because, of course, in 1943 the Japanese army was very close, in fact at times in eastern India. So this immense spending on defence meant that some people who were really quite poor had more income and they were able to buy more food than they had in the past. And the British had decided that since there was no shortage that they didn't need to allocate any foreign exchange for imports of food, and they didn't allow imports of food. The price went up, and then the people who didn't benefit from the boom starved. And he graphically described the poor people coming in from it was actually people from the countryside mostly who came into Calcutta starving. And I later had the opportunity to chat with him about that. It was really a fascinating insight. Sorry, I've perhaps I digressed a little bit there.
But my recollection is you did quite a lot of work yourself on poverty later.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that really got me very interested in it. Now, for a while though, while I was at the bank, I worked mainly on general trade policy issues. So after the Uruguay round, for instance, Alan Winters and I wrote a book which looked at the impact of the Uruguay round. And that work to me was really fascinating because it gave me insights into the world, the WTO, the arcane rules of the WTO, which I really came to appreciate just how fundamental they are, principles of non-discrimination. And the ban on the use of quantitative restrictions. These are very fundamental planks of good trade policy. The quantitative restrictions are the things that give you instability, and at worst they give you famines, as in the case of the Great Bengal famine. But it was for me a great opportunity to learn about WTO trade policy issues. Then